You're listening to a 58 Ember production.
GIRLSCAMP, it's Girls Camp.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Girls Camp podcast. I'm your host, Haley Rawl, and if you are navigating a faith deconstruction too, or are simply fascinated by faith deconstruction journeys, by Mormonism specifically and religion generally, then you are in the right place. I wanted to hop on for a very brief little intro because I do introduce this episode and today's guest, Gabby Wright, but we were chatting before we started, and so you're going to dive in while we're kind of chatting. It might seem a little random, but I wanted to keep some of that in. I also wanted to give a little trigger warning because we are talking about domestic abuse and domestic violence today. So take care of yourself, and there's the trigger warning. I really hope you enjoy this interview, and thanks for listening. And I don't want to project onto you any more than this is the reality for you, but there were so many points in your story, not that the church is to blame, but how much the church played a role at so many key points, at least from your retelling in that voice memo. And I was like, that could have been any of us based on how we were raised and the things we didn't know, but there's just a kind of luck of the draw almost situation. And it's just terrible that we, especially as women, aren't raised with just proper education around domestic violence.
Yes.
Yeah.
No. And it's not a fun topic. My sister today, I talked to her this morning, and she was like, you've always been open to talking about it, but it's not like I'm like, hi, I'm Gabby, domestic violence survivor. And a lot of that is their shame behind it. It's a heavy topic. There's an embarrassment side too. There's so many complex feelings that come with it. I do try to be just open about it because I think that I didn't have that. I didn't know that there were other people in Provo, Utah that went through that.
Totally. And now you know that there are.
Yeah, and they message me. And
really?
It's really sad because I think in a lot of ways, I feel like I got this gift to get out early. And I think a lot more Mormon women experience it their whole lives, and they just didn't say anything, and then they reach a point at 45 and 50 where they're finally the husband actually cheats on them and they leave, or whatever it is. Statistically, it's not like the church is set apart from this statistic.
That domestic abuse happens. I'm gonna keep a lot of that in because I think that was really good.
Great.
But let me just say hello, everyone, and welcome to Girls Camp. I'm Haley Rawl, your host. I'm joined today by Gabby Wright, and we go way back. We were just saying we played soccer together in high school, maybe even before that. Longtime friend, and we recently ran into each other actually at a coffee shop. And you were telling me a little bit more about your story, and now here we are.
I'm honored.
We were already talking about this a bit, but you are going to share your story of experiencing domestic violence, getting out of that situation, where you're at in the healing journey with that, and then also where the Mormon church fits into that picture. So that's what we're talking about today. And just as we were saying, I think there's a lot there that really ties into religious frameworks, to faith, I can imagine. So much to get into.
Can't wait.
Before we jump in, I always like to ask, what are you hoping for in sharing, or what is your intention behind sharing?
I think the first thing is to bring light to a topic that isn't fun to talk about. I think that if there were more people that talked about this being a thing, in my head, there was an idea of what a girl was that was abused. And that sounds terrible, but it was a quiet type of person, and I was loud, and I feel like I was confident in some ways, and I had a good job, all these things where, I don't know, I didn't feel like there were a lot of resources where
you didn't probably just know.
No, exactly.
That it was happening, or know what signs to look for.
Yes, exactly. So I think a big part of that is just bringing awareness. And then 2, I've been in a lot of different stages in my post-Mormonhood. And I told you that a little bit, but there was times where I was middle fingers up and, deep into history and all of these things. But I feel like I've come to a lot of peace of where I'm at now. And I will sometimes take Collins to church, and, we go and do our, it's not the same at all, but I'm not, I guess I have found peace more being in the gray, but not fully. I feel like it's so complex.
And I don't think it needs to be, I mean, I think we get really obsessed with well, are you in or are you out? Or where exactly are you?
Yes.
But you don't have to know.
When it ebbs and flows. Like,
Totally.
I think but the reality is so much, like you said, of my life and experience go back to how the church, how I was raised, beliefs I had, shame, all of this. And so I think that when you can separate those things and actually find yourself, it's so much better.
Yes.
Like, life is still hard, but it's not like I have to find all this purpose and, try to make sense of it.
Totally.
So.
Thank you for that. I can just imagine there's so much, even hearing your story, because you voice memoed me last night and I heard your story when we spoke at the coffee shop. And I can just imagine it's really complicated too, because I was thinking, even in my response to you, I wanted to say, wow, you are so strong. You're so inspiring. But sometimes, I don't know if you feel this way, maybe this is me projecting again, but it's like, you shouldn't have had to have been strong or like inspiring by getting through that. And that doesn't detract from the fact that you were and you are.
Sure.
I can imagine there's also a little bit of like, okay, sure, but like I just had to survive. And like,
yeah, and everyone would do what
totally
I did.
Yeah. Which doesn't detract from like truly how I feel that you are strong and inspiring, but the whole situation is just so shitty that it's just more than anything, it just sucks that happens and there aren't the resources and the education around it. Yeah. So as you said, even though it is difficult to talk about, I'm really grateful that you're willing to talk about it. And I've already learned so much from the pieces of your story that I have heard. Let's do a little bit of context setting. Okay. So if you can just tell us a little bit about your Mormon upbringing, where you lived, what kind of Mormon you were, all that.
I'm a T-bird. We love Tempe High School.
Tempe High School.
There's so many. I love seeing all the guests come back. I know. I'm like, oh, hey, Tanner.
I know. I just interviewed Meredith Peterson is her name. She went to Timpview. She was a little bit younger than us. And she's since transitioned.
Okay.
But anyway, we were just talking about Timpview and I'm like, the things that could be said about that high school alone. Yes. It's just very deep in the heart of Mormonism in many ways.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I feel like just saying you're from Provo your whole life is like, yep, from Provo. And, it captures all of it. Yep. So yeah, I have a very Mormon family. I love them all so much. And I grew up very spiritual, religious, all of that, did the whole thing. Mm-hmm. And then I went to BYU. I didn't want to go to BYU. I really wanted to leave, but just was cheaper. So I ended up there and I ended up going on a mission. I didn't tell my family that I was doing it. So I showed up on my mom's doorstep with my mission call. So that was
surprise them.
Fun.
Where did you go again?
Seattle.
Okay.
Yeah. So I went there and I was I feel like very letter of the law in a lot of ways. Like if I look back, sometimes there's so much pain of who I was trying so hard to do my purpose as a missionary. I feel like I really took it far. And I think a lot of that is because that's what I put my worth on, was how much I served other people and how much I taught them the gospel. And there's so much pressure to do that in a lot of ways. And so even on your mission, how did you have to do a my plan or something where you at the end of your mission you write what your life is going to be like?
I forgot about that. Yeah, but
I found it recently.
Oh no.
And it was I was wow, I would be so disappointed at myself, but also so proud. You look and you see that just how much I've grown up in the last 6, 7, 10 years. I think so much of growing up in the church and in the bubble is that the bubble is real. It just impacts how you think. And even though I had friends who weren't active and I had friends whose moms and dads were out of the picture or they weren't traditional Mormon families, I still lived in the bubble mindset, even though I thought I was different.
No,
does that mean
absolutely. I think because I come from a family that wasn't traditional in a lot of ways, but you're still the norm, the standard is still just traditional unit, married parents, both have good callings.
Yes.
You go to seminary, you prepare for a mission. So even though there's obviously deviations from that norm, those deviations, if anything, just serve to show, at least in that mindset, oh, see, you got to be Mormon because if not, then this happens or this happens. Those deviations, I think for me, almost just serve to continue to feed the narrative that there was only one real right way to do it.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's been a lot of an important piece with leaving and trying to figure out my feelings on the church has been communicating to people that I love. I know the answers to the questions that I have. Like, I know what you can tell me. We can try to sit down and have this discussion about what I don't believe or what I have questions on. But missionary Gabby, Sister Wright, knows those answers very well. And I would see a single mom, less active, and be like, oh, I just know what she needs. Like, I just know it. And that breaks my heart in a lot of ways of just, I don't know if I'd call it pride. I don't know what we call it, of I knew so much more then for what their life was going to look like when I really hadn't lived much. Like,
it's a lot more complicated than we thought.
It is.
Yeah.
And being a mom too, now I think there's so much peace that comes in the church because there's answers that exist. And it sucks sometimes to be like, yeah, I don't know. Or like, I'm like, yeah, just pray. Like, say whatever, like I don't have this structure that I used to have. And it's also very freeing.
Yeah. Yeah. It's scary and freeing.
Yeah.
How would you say you were in high school leading up to your mission? You were saying you were very devout. Did you have any issues with Mormonism at that point? Were you, flirting with any boundaries, or were you just completely doing the thing?
Good question. I feel like I knew that it was true. But like, I also was strange because I didn't read the Book of Mormon until my mission. So it's like, I kind of got there and was like, what do I believe? And I remember knocking on a door, and Seattle is one of the most agnostic areas. Like, when I got there, it was like, good luck, because they're not atheists and they're not, we're not in the Bible Belt, but it was just like, yeah, I'm spiritual and not religious. And so that was, I think, and that's kind of where I've more ended up now. So it makes me laugh in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
But I think that I had this, I guess, just this mindset of like, oh wait, I lost what I was saying. Hold up. Okay, wait, your question was...
Oh, how you were in high school. You said you really believed it was true.
Very believed it was true. And then I went on a mission and was like, oh, wait, what is this? Because to me, the church was so much part of your culture and just community. Like, it impacted everything. And so I don't feel like I actually knew doctrine at all. Like, it was just church, and it was the only true church, and that's it. And so I feel like I did have questions. Like, polygamy always bugged me. I'm not one to hold back on my thoughts, but I hope this makes sense. I feel like I could almost say my question or whatever. Like, I liked to own that I didn't know and believe it fully, but I believed in the basics of it. Like, it was like, yeah, but it will all work out. I just feel like that's how I believed.
Yeah, I can totally relate.
Do you know what I mean? Like, I had questions.
Yes.
I didn't like that there were only men on the stand. Like, I've definitely had times where I questioned just authority in general. I don't have to be this full black sheep, but like, I want to be a little bit different. And that's in Provo. You had to be like to be different, you had to like wear shorter shorts, or, and I mean, I wasn't allowed to wear bikinis, so couldn't do that then. Yeah. But
the standards were so strict and so high that it didn't take a lot to feel a little bit rebellious.
Yes.
And I can resonate, because I think as a more strong-willed woman who I felt like, well, I have opinions and they might be different, but it was all very much within the box of this is of course true.
Yes.
But we can kind of push certain things here and there, but obviously it's all true. So it didn't feel like really ever considering or wondering about the truth of it all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a good way to put it.
So you went on your mission. When did your ex come into the picture? And let's start with that story.
Yeah. So I was dating somebody else and then broke up with them. And then like a month after, I met my ex through my cousin, some more Timfew people. I texted my cousin today. I'm like, do you want a shout out for setting us up? And he's like, as long as you say I will never set anybody up again,
He's
sure.
Like, I'm retiring from setting people
But it wasn't actually. It was just through mutual friends. And so we were in the same ward. Technically, like, our streets down in BYU were close. And so, yeah, it'll be weird to process feelings that will come up in this. Like, I feel like the body really does keep the score. It was funny. Just barely, I'm like, oh, hey, Tommy, how we doing?
I know. Take it however you need to, because I can imagine it's not fun to relive.
It's interesting. But anyways, so I was home from my mission, I think for about a year and a half when I met him, maybe a year. And we just like started dating pretty quickly. Like we were just friends and then just started going on dates and whatever. And I felt so respected because we didn't kiss immediately. Like I look back, I'm like, oh gosh. And he's like, you're special. I don't want to kiss you yet. You know, like those things actually do affect you because I feel like so much of the culture of back then too was just makeouts and whatever. So then when I found this boy that was like, oh, like you're really special. It was like, oh, well, yeah, I am. But like, you know, a boy thinks this and that's
it means
weird
a lot
to look back on.
Yeah.
Like, you know?
Yeah. Well, I'm even thinking about, and not that it's any of those people's fault at all, the mutual friends. And it sounds like this person, kind of again to your earlier point, there's no red flags, right? It's like, oh, this person is friends with these cool guys that I know from high school and they're all great guys.
Yeah.
And he's connected to these people and those people. And just already from the very beginning of this story, I feel like you're seeing kind of the power of how even the culture can kind of hide, like protect people.
Yes, 100%. Yes. And I think with that, it was like he was AP on his mission. There were all these things that he checked the box. Mm-hmm. And I wouldn't say I went with that checklist, but you'd hear those things and they're like these buzzwords where you're like, oh, okay, great.
No, it means
like,
something. It
they
really
did.
does.
It really did. And so, and it meant trust. Like that's what's really interesting to me as far as the church goes is the protection, especially for these males in a lot of times authoritative roles, and the trust that these titles can bring. And you hear that all the time. Oh, they are a bishop. And to me, it almost brings me back more now. Like, I'm like, oh, you know,
you're more suspicious of people in
like,
that. Yeah.
I don't love that because I think I look at my ex and I'll get into it, but he aspired to be those things, even with what happened. And so it's like,
yeah, it's complicated. And for anyone who's listening who doesn't know, APs, Bentley and I joke about this all the time because he was an AP too, but it's the highest leadership position you can be in as a missionary. So you're really close to the mission president. You're basically in charge of all the other missionaries, sort of. I mean, you're still a missionary too, but I think that's such a status thing.
Oh,
and
for sure.
we joke about it now, but it was a big deal. Like, I think when
Yes.
I heard Bentley was an AP, like that, to your point, you connect that with trust.
Yes.
Oh, this person worked their way up in the system that I believe in that rewards people who are righteous and who are good Christ-like people. And so it makes so much sense that you take that for, okay, this is probably a good person.
Yes. And a lot of times I think it can come with certain characteristics, like they're great teachers or, you know, like it comes with these things that it may just be who they were. Maybe it's how the church raised them, you know, a lot of different things. But yeah. So then we met and started dating, and we definitely were a hot-headed couple. I don't know. Like, I would share I'm not someone to just not share my thoughts and opinions. So I feel like when I met that with him, I almost changed this narrative that I liked it because we pushed each other to be better. So it was like, oh yeah, we challenge each other. And that was a big part of just innocence in a lot of ways, like not knowing what gaslighting was or, you know, all these different things.
How old were you when you started dating?
22.
Okay.
Yeah. We got engaged. Like we would always, and he was actually engaged before.
Oh, interesting.
I thought of this morning because I was like, oh, this is an important piece. So my sister actually was like, just remember how crazy his ex-fiance was.
Ooh.
And she wasn't. I've talked with her. She's an amazing human. She reached out to me after my divorce. And actually it was really powerful because she was like, I wish I would have reached out to you. And I just thought, oh, he must treat her differently than he treated me. And to me, like me and my sister, she was saying, we genuinely believed him when he would tell stories of her being crazy. And it's interesting now because I'm like, well, I'm sure I'm a crazy ex in his story. Like I'm this crazy ex that's on a podcast. I don't know. Like I don't know the narrative that he has of me anymore. But going back to that time, it was so stressful because it was like, do I reach out to this fiance?
because he was feeding you. She was so crazy.
Yes.
And that's how he was justifying a broken engagement.
Yes.
Which is a big deal in Mormonism too.
It was, for sure. And even like in some ways his family played into that. Like she was very difficult and, you know, they just weren't meant to be. And I think that looking back was there were red flags, but I feel like it was almost how he could explain it was as if it was nothing to worry about. He was actually an EFY counselor as well, got fired. Like once we were married, I digged into it more and it was like, oh, okay. Should have looked into that.
But
you know?
I mean, why would you think to? That's the thing. And you were saying this in your voice memo to me last night, but you don't think people are lying to you.
No.
Your first assumption is not this person is lying to me, especially at that age, especially when they were an AP, especially. So yeah, if a guy at that age said, I have a crazy ex and I got fired because the leader of EFY sucked, I'd be like, oh, that sucks.
Yes, exactly.
You're not thinking like, wait, I have to get to the bottom of this.
Exactly. For sure. And especially when I think we grow up with that innocence, like you just want to believe people. Like, and I think that's so sweet and great. And it changed the trajectory of my life in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And so we got engaged. Like we would always, you know, were we going to get married? Were we not? And we were about to do counseling, you know, and so then that was a gift from his parents to us, is that we would have counseling when we first got married. And so it was like, okay, but like we just had so much passion for, you know, making this work. Yeah. And I think a lot of it was like, we just thought, I don't know. I told you this as well. It's very, I think with the law of chastity, that was so much of the shame that impacted my commitment to him, because it was like, oh, I crossed these boundaries, I feel guilty, and then okay, we're gonna work on it together and be better. And it was this mind game that was exhausting, because I tried to like turn to God and be like, do I marry him, do I not, you know? And whatever thoughts I had were also just human. We just have natural thoughts that happen, and you
were trying to assign what God was telling you or not telling you.
Yeah, exactly.
One thing I want to say really quick there that I was thinking about too is I felt like it obviously wasn't the same situation because Bentley is not that type of person, but I can really relate to, it's such an odd thing because you kind of just feel like once you get to a certain point with someone, you just have to get married.
Right.
And that point is, I think, partially sexually. Like if you cross certain sexual boundaries, then you feel like, well, now I've given that to this person, so I just need to marry them. I also think you trauma bond when you do cross certain boundaries, and then you gave a hand job and then you're both sobbing in the car and then you're like, but we'll get through this and let's go tell our bishop and repent. And that is bonding in a really scary, dangerous way. And as you were just kind of explaining your pre-marriage situation, I was thinking about, luckily, Bentley ended up being a really great guy, but like, I can really relate to just, it's a really confusing time. There's a huge pressure to get married really quickly. And so even if there are certain, now in retrospect, you could call them maybe more serious red flags, you're not going to be able to see those. And also there's so many forces just propelling you to just get married.
Yes, exactly. And we don't talk about it. That poor girl couldn't talk to someone and be like, hey, he tells me, hey, we went this far, now you need to finish me off.
Yeah.
You turned me on, you did that. Like that, I would never have told somebody that, because, so yes, that is a huge red flag.
Yes.
Like if I had TikTok back then and I could see that girls were, because I feel like now you come across things that are like, oh, this is a red flag or whatever.
Or this is like sexual manipulation or sexual, maybe borderline sexual assault. Yeah.
And it's like, oh, but I feel like there was so much shame to talk about that. So much of my life from the time that we were dating was to protect him. And that is like so much of abuse, but it was this mindset. And I think that exists a lot in just church leaders. Like a lot of times I've had conversations where it's like, well, yeah, but he's a bishop and maybe he was trying his best. And like I was sharing a story about crossing like very inappropriate questions that a bishop had asked me. And I find so many people, devout members, where I used to do this too, is you give the benefit of the doubt to them first because of that title and because of that. And was so much of what it was.
Yeah. So, and you wanted to protect the other huge factor is you want to protect, okay, if I do marry this person, I don't want to now go tell my mom or my sister or my friend, like, is this abuse? Because then if you end up marrying him, I had a boyfriend when I can tell you who they are when we're done with this.
Perfect.
You would know them. But when I was 14, and there was, I think the further I get from it, the more I see it as, it wasn't sexual assault, but it was a lot of sexual manipulation. And a lot of it was fueled by these things you're saying.
Yeah.
Where it would be, I was so guilty about certain things that he had pushed me to do. And then I would be sobbing and he would be like, well, you know, just using kind of this, I remember he would say like he was connected through like other communities. He actually played soccer. So he would be like, well, the boys I play soccer with, like they do this and it's fine. So like, it's not a big deal if you gave me a hand job or whatever. And how much more susceptible you are to that when you have never heard that that's a possibility, when all you've heard about sex is don't do it. I didn't even know what I was doing. Like he would put my hand somewhere and I didn't even really understand. And then I would feel guilty and just realizing like the susceptibility factor, I think is so huge there. Like you're just more susceptible to it if you're not educated. And if you've never been told like, hey, people might try and take advantage of you in XYZ ways. And then you can be like, oh, that's what's happening here. But when you don't even fully understand what sex is, like when I was 14, it is so much more confusing and so much harder to protect yourself. And to your point, I couldn't just go tell my mom because I didn't want my mom to know I was doing any of those things anyway. So I couldn't say, hey, this happened. I'm uncomfortable with it, because I couldn't even tell her we were making out laying down. And so then you're more isolated in that situation too.
And it's in that community where that just, like, we didn't talk about those things at all.
And probably, I mean, at least in my experience, when I did go confess things to my bishop, never was I asked, did you consent? Are you comfortable?
No.
Like, is this person treating you okay?
Right.
That was never part of the conversation. No. It was just like, where were you touched or vice versa? And how long can you not take the sacrament for? Yeah. So there was no mechanisms in place to like help us, even when we were forced to talk about those things.
Yes.
Or I keep saying we, but when I was forced to talk about those things, there was never any help to like differentiate, which I'm sure this is happening to so many women.
Oh,
especially.
I'm sure. Yes. Yeah. And I think it's so much of just, I'm so proud of where women are finding their voice and all of this, because it exists in the world, like the workplace. I find that a lot. And so much of part of me coming on and talking is using that voice, because it's like, yeah, this sucks. But if you are going through those things, then we should at least be able to know who to confide in.
Yeah.
And I think that's what I found post my marriage is an awesome support system, like a best friend that I can tell literally anything and everything to. But my best friends, I did not talk about anything sexual years ago, because it was such, I feel like you're trying to protect your own image. Like, I was this sister missionary, or, you know, I was the Laurel's class president or whatever it was. And I think that plays a huge part into that protection.
Yeah. So. And women, I don't think it's as common. I think about Tim Few, and I think boys were probably talking about sex stuff, but I was super close with my girlfriends and we didn't really talk about details of things, because it felt embarrassing.
Yes,
and it felt slutty, and it felt all these things that just prevent you from having the opportunity to open up about it to anyone and have them help you see what's going on.
Yeah. So a lot of during dating, those experiences related so back to religious stuff. Like, it would be like garments. Like, I would literally like do things and then put my garments back on, or be like, no, I just look back and I'm like, what even? I believe so much that they would still protect me from these things. And it's like, that's just not.
It wasn't actually in reality doing
that.
And
like, how would that work? You know, like logically.
Yeah.
So anyways, so then we've pushed through, I guess, I'm sure so much trauma bond had to have been there too. And I asked all the right questions. I will say, like, I'm great asking about porn. Like, you have to be at this age. Like, it was like, okay, like, what does this look like and all of this. And so those questions were asked even my parents, I know, would say they both sat him down and talked with him. And I remember they were like, we're going to ask about porn. And I'm sure it was their first like kid that they were going to do that. But at that time of your life, or 10 years ago, or however many years ago, 6 years ago, that's just what you did then. Like it started to become a topic that you talked about. But people can lie. And that's
so exactly, he just lied.
Yeah. And what he was really good at is taking lies and adding in these pieces of truth that made you feel like he was very vulnerable. Like, oh, I'm going to wait to take the sacrament and like, you know, like really work on myself. And, you know, like these things that just you felt like he just
tricky.
Like knew.
Because it wasn't, oh no, I never look at porn. I never have. I never
exactly.
will. It was like, oh, it's maybe like something I'm working on.
Yeah,
but
it's like I masturbate. Like, of course I've seen porn. And it's like, okay, well, like to what level? And, you know, like, and it wasn't like it was a one-time conversation. Like I knew that, you know, and that plays a part because of the dishonesty that comes later.
Yes.
And so anyways, we ended up getting married and
in the temple, right?
Yeah, in the temple, Provo City. And 3 days later on my honeymoon, well, and I will add, like, it was a whole thing. Like he was sobbing at my wedding. Like everyone was like, wow, he just loves you so much. And I'm like, I know, this is just so great. All I want is to be loved. This is so great.
Yeah.
And we were in Jamaica, and 3 days later, he asked me to grab his phone. He was in the bathroom, and there was a message from Tinder and Snapchat on there. And I was like, what the heck? Because I'm kind of a snoopy person anyway. So I was like, how did this slip by mind?
Tinder
like,
on my
I used to,
phone.
like dating, he'd be like, you know, he'd be talking to a girl that he did a lot of things with, and I'd be like, why are you still talking to her? And he'd be like, oh, we were just so sensitive. Like, don't be like that. And be a cool girl. And I'm like, well, yeah, I do want to be cool. Like, I want to be chill about it, but like, that is uncomfortable, but you know, whatever.
Yeah,
So I snooped. Like, I will always, I'm still a snooper. And that's not great, but a lot of it's my trauma. So
yeah,
it's
well,
fine.
and it sounds like
whatever.
you're suspicious, and rightly so.
Yes. And so anyways, so I was like, what? So I dig into it. And I find all this previous history of sexting and all this stuff with these girls that he had
while you
been talking to during our engagement. And I just came in and was like, who are you? Like, what are you? What is this? And he just like sobbed, and he's like, I'm so sorry. Like, we're married now, and I promise you, like, I'm committed. And I'm like, yeah, but this was literally like the day before our wedding. Probably because we were trying to be temple worthy. So he went and found it elsewhere.
Because you had not.
Because we were trying to, you know, so it's like, okay. And so I feel like a lot of the domestic violence would start with something like he was caught in some way. And so he was caught. He didn't come and tell me that either. And I just like sobbed my eyes out. I remember he just like held me. And then I got angry. Like, you go through all the stages of grief. And I'm like, who the hell did I just marry? Like, what just happened?
Temple, like, you think you're with this person for eternity too. It's not, I mean, it's terrible regardless, but like, I just want to emphasize, like, that temple marriage thing adds a really huge layer of like pressure.
Thank you. Yes, for sure. Because it's like forever. And it was also, can I forgive this? Like, so much of that instant, like, oh, what I can control is me. Mm-hmm. And so it was like, oh, can I forgive him forever? Am I ever going to be able to look at him the same? And so then I got really angry, and I tried to leave the apartment or the hotel, and he wouldn't let me leave.
This is on your honeymoon.
Mm-hmm. And so on my honeymoon, he grabbed my phone and he shattered it. He pushed me. Like, he got very physical. Like, I wouldn't say, it's hard because I compared to what I later experienced, but like, that was physical. He crossed boundaries he shouldn't have crossed, and like threw my suitcase and told me I couldn't leave, couldn't call my family. And it was like, you're doing this. And so much, like, I love swearing now. I love a good F word, and I love a good bitch. But when you're experiencing it in those ways, it's not okay at all. Like, it breaks my little heart of someone who like didn't even watch R-rated movies.
Oh yeah. And
to be called an effing bitch for the rest of, you know, my time. It was just so terrible.
To this
from
man
somebody
you just
that
married in the temple.
Yes. Like, and what that meant, like, that the temple meant that he was trying his best. Like, yes, there were so many keys there. So anyway, so it got physical, and
that was on the third day of your honeymoon. So that soon after being married.
Yeah. And that's when it was like, a lot of it was to protect him during dating. And from that point on is when my whole existence, it felt like, was to protect his image, that he could never be like that. And it was also like to protect himself from that. So he didn't like it when I would bring up that he hurt me, or he didn't bring, like, does that make sense? Like, it was protecting him from himself in a lot of ways.
You were kind of buying into his own delusion.
Yes.
That, like, that's not really who he was.
Yes, because he's better than that. And
even though you both knew
right
full well, because
exactly
you experienced it.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so that was hard because I just debated. Like, I remember going to sleep and it was like, do I call my parents? My parents aren't wealthy. They just spent all this money on a wedding. How embarrassing is that? We were Googling if we get an annulment, because I was pretty serious. Like, I don't want to be married to you anymore.
Like, don't treat me that way.
You crossed my, like, you know. And so it was just like, we explored an annulment, but then didn't get much further. And so then from that point on, it was like, oh, hey, family. Like, I reached out on his phone because I was like, I have to tell them I'm okay. Like, I don't have my phone. So I reached out on his phone and told them, like, oh, I dropped my phone in the toilet. And I just became kind of klutzy. From that point on, all these things I just took the blame for. It wasn't even like, oh, he dropped my phone, you know, and it was an accident. It was like always me doing something.
In order to explain these things that were happening.
Yes. Because I knew telling my parents, like, if I called my dad, he'd be like, I'm flying you back. Money wouldn't have been an issue. I know they would have taken good care of me. But the guilt that I put on myself of just like, I can't do this to them. And then also like to get divorced that young, like, that's just so embarrassing is how I felt.
Yeah.
So yeah, from then it just was terrible. We'd have maybe 2 days of good, and then he'd pull my hair while we were driving, and he'd hit me with a hydro flask in the face. And like, I have walked on a freeway in Idaho from trying to jump out of the car, like to get out of that physical pain that he could do. And so from that point, like, it just was so sad. And a lot of it, I think, was, like I mentioned, when he was about to be caught with something, because he had a severe addiction. And I think it's important. I get really passionate on this because I think a lot of times in Utah Valley, it's like, oh, someone looked at porn and they're an addict. And it's like, no, I lived with a porn addict.
Yeah.
And it was, they would leave work and they would try to just all sorts of crazy things. It, like,
controlled his life.
Controlled his life.
Pornography. And, like, was sexting and stuff part of that addiction?
Yeah, it was a huge part of, with real people, was a huge thing. So, like, he was actually on dating apps in Rexburg, Idaho. Oh, because that's a big part. We were in Utah for all of our dating. And then he was like, hey, we should move. I don't want to live here anymore. So we should move. And I'm like, I'm always down for an adventure.
Yeah,
so I'm like,
sure,
yeah, that sounds great. I'll leave Provo.
Yeah.
So we moved to Rexburg immediately. So 3 weeks after we moved to Rexburg, another bubble that I'm like, oh boy.
Yeah.
That time was like
the second Provo.
So much dark clouds for me. But
I bet.
yeah, so that apartment was just terrible. So yeah, that addiction just ran everything.
And it was oftentimes his abuse was triggered if you like found
found it. Yes. And it's so sad too to look back where I would have so many moments of trying to be an understanding wife of this guy struggling with porn. And a lot of people go through that. Like, there's so many different various things, whatever we decide in our marriages, whatever. But like, the amount of times, like, I would try to just listen to podcasts and try to read things about how to be more supportive and not freak out if he did these things. But for me, so much of it was what came after was not normal. You know, like, my life, I genuinely am lucky to be alive with how physical it got. And that just, like, breaks my heart. Yeah. Like, I think back to that girl who just was trying so hard and was trying, like, I was not perfect for sure. Like, when you live with somebody, you tend to match their level in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Like, I know what I am capable of too, but like, to see how many times I tried to just leave. And there's a stat it takes 7 times to leave abuse typically. And I think I probably tried to leave hundreds of times because that was just I was a flight. Well, it depends on the moment, but usually something would happen and I'd be like, I've got to get out of here. Like, my home is not safe. And so I had a bag that I kept in my closet, had an extra pair of garments and some makeup to go. And but he would, like he broke 3 of my phones. Like he would just put my phone underwater, right? When I'd be like, I'm calling my dad or I'm calling the police, he'd take my phone and dump it in water.
So you couldn't.
So I couldn't. And so like to a certain degree, you see how much darkness this person is capable of. And I think you try to test the waters of how you can get out. But if he was capable of doing that many things to me, then it was like, he could do a lot more as well.
Totally.
And
You're
so
scared.
Yes, so scared.
And I just want to say, I think that's probably one of the things that is so complicated about abuse, I can imagine, is of course you're not going to be like your best self. Of course you're going to see probably sides of yourself that maybe you feel, certain ways about, but like you're literally doing what you have to do to literally survive.
Right.
And I'm just so sorry, obviously, about all of that. And also, I'm just sad that there would ever be any shame around really behaving in any type of way when you're in like an abusive situation. I also wanted to say, I really appreciate you speaking to that porn and sex addiction piece, because I think a big part of deconstruction for a lot of us is around sex.
Yeah.
And that includes porn, that includes for some people polyamory or whatever it may be. And I've talked about that a lot on the podcast. And I also think it's really important to speak to where it can get really bad and really dark, and where it can get really destructive, not only to the person who has a porn or sex addiction, but also to the people around them. Right. And I appreciate you speaking to that, because I think that's a huge piece of that picture. And it's interesting hearing you as you're, in some ways it's probably a good thing that, porn is getting destigmatized, even in religious spaces. I mean, Mormonism hasn't gone that far, but I can see how that almost maybe in some ways felt worse for you, because then you're reading like, oh, it's just,
it's fine.
It's fine. And you're like, but this doesn't feel fine.
Right.
And this feels like really serious.
Yeah.
And again, I think it's just like a lack of education, because if porn is just stigmatized point blank, it's very difficult to understand nuances and boundaries and where it actually does become a problem.
Right.
And just having no experience with that or understanding around that feels like it almost did the opposite thing, where you were like, well, maybe this is just like what people do.
Yes. Yeah. And like I started to call friends that I knew their husbands struggled with porn, and I'd like try to get pieces from them. But like what they were experiencing was probably a pretty normal situation that, people go through. Mm-hmm. And I wouldn't share all my things. So I became very strategic on what I shared and what I didn't, because it was to protect him and us, because that's what I was supposed to do. Because if we were going to be together forever, then like that's what needed to be done. Yeah. And so, and I think a lot of that with that porn piece is the dishonesty. Like that is my thing now, is like just own where you're at. Because if, we talked about a boundary that we had as a couple and he broke that boundary, that's not okay. Yep. And so that's like, that gives me the narrative that I think is applicable to no matter what your usage is, no matter how you're doing it. I think the key there is honesty and, with your partner and trying to figure that out.
Because how can there be trust if there's not communication?
Exactly.
And then respect to the boundaries that are in place.
Yes.
And if your partner wants to change that boundary, they have to communicate that to you. And it sounds like there was no communication. And then, of course, when he was caught, then he literally abused you.
Yeah, exactly. And I think a lot of that, it was interesting because all during this time, I'm going to church. I think I had 3 or 4 black eyes from him, just covered in bruises, and it just became, I played soccer. Like with my parents, I came home and I had this huge bruise on my back, and they were like, what happened? And I was like, soccer. I never played a day of soccer in Rexburg, Idaho, but I knew it was believable, and that's just part of it. And I will never forget one time we were with a group of friends, and I had these friends in Rexburg, and they were like the best couple friends ever. And they impacted so much of my safety. Like I was like, if I could just be with them, then he's normal and, whatever. Because in public, we just had our show. Like we were dynamic, we were whatever. He's outgoing. Like I feel like we'd play into like, first year of marriage, and it's like, and I remember Googling things like, what is normal for a first year of marriage? Because everyone was saying that. It was like, first year of marriage is so hard. And I'm like, okay, like, do I push through this? Like, you know, because
Is
these
this
things
what they're
aren't
talking
okay.
about?
And him and
Yeah.
I would talk about it a lot. It's not like he would like hit me and then we'd never discuss it. It was like, okay, it was like, he's like, I know I need to be better. And so then he'd try, and then he'd like buy me hundreds of dollars of stuff. And then we just start this cycle again and again. And so with Idaho, though, it was so crazy because he was teaching Sunday school at the time, and people would say he was the best Sunday school teacher they've ever had. And so I just would sit there and just be like, he wants to try so hard and just is missing these points. And where I'm at now, it's a lot to process. Like, he can have his own story and that's great and whatever, but his life impacted me a lot then, and it changed the rest of my life. So
Yeah.
anyway, so then we lived in Idaho for 9 months, and then he got an internship somewhere in Boston and Texas. And we were like, okay, where should we go? And we decided to go live with family, because he was like, maybe if we live with your family, I won't hurt you, and like it will be helpful.
So he was basically saying like, I'm really trying to be
He
better.
was trying, yeah. And like, we'd go to counseling and we would share pieces. Like, I just feel like I had it nailed down of like how much to tell that like this wasn't normal and something was off, but like I was still okay. Like, I wasn't being strangled.
So they wouldn't step in and like,
Yes, because
yeah,
my
report.
Yes. And so, which I think as an abuse victim, you want so much control because you don't have it at all, that it was like to have the state control me, terrible. Or to have like somebody else make the decision for the rest of my life. And I'm also mourning that like this is who I wanted to have my life with. Like, you know, like I genuinely liked him. So it was like this hard thing. So we decided to move in with my cousins, and they did not know a thing because we just hid it. It would be in the car on the way to work that he would like explode on me or whatever. And it just was so toxic. And so we'd try and, you know, we'd all the things. And so then I left Texas, and I was very, I think, strategic then of like, if I can get away for some time, then I can figure out what I want. Because during all of this, I was praying every day if I should get divorced. And I was also, I feel like before it was like I mentioned, I was always, you know, do I marry him? Do I not? And I never got an answer. And so I remember when it clicked with divorce was like, Gabby, maybe you're not going to get an answer that you should get divorced. Maybe just like you didn't get anything then, like this is going to be your choice. And that in my spiritual journey, I feel like has been my relationship with God, is just like, you are going to live your life and I will try to bless your path, whatever you choose. So I ended up leaving Texas and going to stay with family for a little bit. So I was like, oh, hey, I'm going to come stay with my sister. And everyone was just kind of like, okay, whatever. Because you'd never think it. Like,
no one
I've talked to people now and they're like, I'm not surprised that he did, but never would you have guessed.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, there wasn't enough for them that they could be like, hey, is he hitting you?
Yes, exactly.
But once you told them, they're like, I can see how he would be capable of something like that.
And so anyway, so I moved back, and that time away, just like 3 weeks, was really, I think, empowering for myself of just like, okay, I am just going to try to live my life the best I can. But I was always still very committed because that's just what you do. And like to try to see if you should get divorced in the church back then, no talks were about divorce. No talks were about abuse. And I think they've done a much better job about talking about that recently.
Good. I'm glad.
From what I've seen. But I wouldn't say that it's a great resource if you're trying to make that decision.
And so when you were at that time trying to consult, is this justifiable to divorce my husband over? You just weren't finding anything.
No. And just because I think a lot of it is very vague too, like I'd Google at night, is one punch abuse? Like, you know, and you'd always hear things. It's hard to, 'cause a lot of times people will be like, I would have never let that happen. Or like, I wish I was there and I would have punched him for you. And I'm like, you have no idea what I did to fight for my life.
Yeah.
So like, it's so, you just don't know until you're there.
No.
And that's the truth.
And there's so many factors, and I think you speak to that so well. There's so many factors because, as you said, you married this person. You were in love to some extent, probably with this person at one time, and then there's all these pressures, and then this person is telling you they're going to change. So it's like maybe they will this time. Like, yeah, that's, I think, so reductive to think, oh, well, my boundaries are this and I would never, whatever. And also to the point of susceptibility.
Right.
No one knows how they're going to be in that situation. And also, I don't think a lot of people can understand the layers to which we were made to be susceptible to things like that.
Exactly. And I think a great story that I feel like shares a lot of his mindset too. I came home one day and was like, I'm going to get a second piercing. And back then, that was not a thing.
Mm-hmm.
And he was like, name one mission president's wife who has a second piercing. And it was actually really, I remember this so well because I was like, he actually thinks he's going to be a mission president. And it was like, you're still aspiring for this. Like, this is still the top of your mind with all that we've been through. Like, I'm like in awe because he knew it was abuse. Like, we talked about it. It wasn't like we just never, it was like, you're abusive. How are we going to fix, like whatever.
He knew he was abusing you.
Yes.
But not only did he still think he could become a mission president, he could still say to you, don't you make a decision about your ear that might affect me becoming a mission president.
Exactly.
And it's like, well, you beat me though. Yes. So like.
And that's what happened that night. Like, it escalated so much that like whatever happened, it started because of that. And he beat me that night. And it's like, wow. And that's why like getting my ear piercings was so freeing because I'm like, screw ever being that. Like, yeah, it just is mind-boggling to me. So
that story, as you said, it really says so much about also, and not that this is everybody by any means, but it's like, what are we weighing here? A woman choosing to get a second piercing versus like hitting a woman.
Exactly.
And how in some way there was enough that he could pull from that, like he had the right to say, you can't get a second piercing.
Yeah.
But then he justifies physically abusing you. Yeah. And I think that happens, that mismatch, the wrong priorities in small ways and in super huge ways like that too.
And I think so much of that is because it was public versus private. An ear piercing said something. Yeah. It was a statement.
People were going to see it.
It was rebellion. And no one else can see what happens behind closed doors. And so anyway, so then I ended up coming back to Utah and we were committed again to try to make it work. And I think a lot of that is just that forever mindset of just like, I'm in this forever. Like, I made this commitment. I got to do it. I remember one night he confessed to me that he had cheated on me during more of engagement and dating stuff. So he like approached me one night and was like, hey, I haven't been honest with you. And I'm like, okay. And he told me like all these stories. And I was just like, who are you? Like, it was way worse than just like what I thought than porn. And, like actually meeting up with girls. And I don't know whatever happened with marriage. I know he was on dating apps and sexting all the time, which was just embarrassing. Like, looking back, people are like, well, yeah, I saw him on Mutual, but I didn't know, to say anything. And I'm like, oh, okay, just the whole town of Rexburg knew my husband was on dating apps. Like,
on Mutual, Mormon dating app.
Mormon dating apps in Rexburg while married.
Good
Haley.
Hell.
And then, so anyways, like, I just can't.
Also the dissonance there of like, okay, you're going to be a mission president, but you're on a public Mormon dating app as a married man.
Yeah. But then you could always say, oh, I don't know what happened.
Yeah.
It's just inactive.
Or someone used my, yeah.
So anyways, so then he told me all this stuff that night. And I just remember going on a drive and I was like, you know what? I have tried so hard to leave in the middle of the night. So much of the abuse would happen. Like, it escalates so far. And then at 4 a.m., I'd be like, I'm leaving. We're getting divorced. And he'd be like, then you need to move everything out of this house. And so we would pack up my whole house. And my dishes, I'd be like, I don't want my dishes. Be like, I don't care. And he'd put my third story of my apartment. And then I'd get everything in the car and he would have my keys inside. And I'd be locked out of my apartment with everything in my car. And I would just be like, do I go to the people next door? But so much of shame stopped me from asking for help. Like, I remember I'd look up the women's shelter before going to my friends. Like, and I'm like, I don't know if that was just to protect him. I don't know what that was. But it's so sad because it'd be like, well, maybe the women's shelter, like, they won't know if I go back to him. They won't know whatever it is, right?
Yeah, the anonymity, I think it makes so much sense.
And so then I would just like wait, and then I'd be so tired at 8 a.m. that like we just start over again. And that would be what we did. that night I was like, you know what? I'm not going to leave tonight. And I was like, I'll leave tomorrow. And there were times where like I thought about just going in like the middle of my job, but Rexburg was a drive away from my family. It like the 4 hours seemed like so much. Like it just felt like such a commitment.
Yeah.
And I had told one friend that he had been hurting me, and she had grown up with abuse. And so I feel like I knew that she could see both sides, and she could see this empathetic side that I had. She gave really good advice, and she just let me do my thing, which I think at that point, again, you just want control. I think she just listened at that time and made sure that I was like, she'd check in on me, but she didn't say you need to go
in and say you have to leave. It wouldn't have worked. She just needed to support you.
And strategically, I knew that. Like I knew she would be a friend that would do that for me, because I knew if I called my dad, he'd be like, "You're done. Like you're never seeing this man again." Yeah. And so that night, I just was like, I'm just gonna go to bed. So I remember just like laying down, and I was like, I'm leaving tomorrow. And he said something like, "You're so amazing. I'm so lucky." And I was like, you have no idea. Like, I'm done. I can't do this anymore. That next morning, I went to work and I called my sister. I was like, hey, I don't know if you're going to believe me, but I need you to believe me. I have been abused for the last 1.5 years. And she's like, what do you mean abuse? And I'm like hitting and strangling and beat up. And I'm like, do you remember this bruise? That was him. Do you remember this and this? And she just was like, what? Like, there's no way. And so she just was like, she was perfect. And she said, well, what do you need? And I was like, I need to not have anything of his. I can't have his phone. Whatever was ours was his, right? So
yes, you couldn't take
we had one car. So I was like, I need to drop the car back off there. Like, I cannot have anything that makes me feel like I need to stay or that I owe him in any way. We did exactly that. And she came and got me, and I stayed with my family, and I was still very much blindfolded. The Gabby then was still so much protecting him, very strategic on what I told anyone to. I ended up saying to my siblings that they can't tell my parents that it was physical. So it was like, okay, well, I think I'm going to leave, but I could still go back. So I told him I needed 3 days or something. I don't remember. And so I was going to think about it and have some time, but I finally told people. And I think that was the just first step of like, people are in my corner and I'm going to remember what love actually is. Mm-hmm. At that point, it was just, that he was unfaithful. And I kind of just was going to ride that because that seemed less embarrassing than physical violence.
Yeah. Like, and more common, maybe.
Yeah. Like, and a reason, like it was enough.
Yes. But enough that people would be like, yeah, I would leave my partner if they were.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so then a few days later, like 6 days or something, I need to look back and see exactly, but I was holding a baby. I was a nanny at the time. I had already started my divorce papers. I was wanting to move to BYU, Hawaii, and just like get out of town. And it asks you if you're pregnant at all. And I was like, no. And I checked the box, and I just was like, okay, like I have irregular periods. I'm just going to check just to make sure I'm not like overreacting, because I just getting nervous. And I, at work, took a pregnancy test, and it was pregnant. And it was like my whole world stopped. And I was so angry, because you imagine being so happy to experience pregnancy tests. Like, there's surprises, and then there's like that sort of surprise that was like, is he going to be in my life for the rest of my life? Like, I just said goodbye to him. I just committed to be done, and now I have no idea what my life is going to look like. Ugh.
I can't even imagine. That timing is so, I'm curious how you make sense of it now, because I mean, I don't know what your belief framework was at that point too, but I can imagine that could have been really confusing.
Yes.
Of like, what does this mean?
Yes. Oh, for sure. Especially when you are living in those spiritual blinders. It was like, does this mean I need to stay with him?
Is this a sign?
Yes. And I was very much like that. So it was like, exactly. And so I called my dad first, and he was like, well, you have to make some decisions. Do you want to keep it? Do you want to stay with him? And I was like, oh, so I actually haven't been honest with you. And I was like, I can't ever go back to him. Like, I'm unsafe. And especially you get into mama protection mode, because it was like, oh my gosh, like once I knew it was her, like that I had this thing in me, it was like, I will never go back to that, because all you want to do is protect that baby.
Yeah.
And so I thought about abortion. I went through all the things. Like, it would have been classified as okay, you know, like in the church, you know, because you look at the handbook and all the things, and it was like, what do I do? And I just knew that I don't know how it all works, but like the mindset that baby gave me was enough is enough, and I can't do this anymore. I think it's easy to say, the state actually, with like the law side of things, they always say, well, just because they hurt an adult doesn't mean they could hurt a child. And it's like, I'm like, well, no, like, and sure, maybe that, whatever. I just think that I know what he's capable of. And so to have that mindset to just be like, I'm going to protect her at all costs.
And that lack of trust, not trusting your partner to care properly, even if it was an abuse, like for your child, like, yeah, that's really powerful.
Yeah. So at that point, it was just, I think, a lot of faith struggles. Like, I look at all my videos at that time and I was just crying all the time. It was so much fear about providing, and I was older. I was 24 at the time. So I feel like, you know, I wasn't a 16-year-old pregnant. So I feel like it was a little bit easier to be like, okay, I can try to make a career out of my life, you know, whatever. And so
also, you're just pregnant, like even the hormones and I don't know if you were sick, but it's just like,
I lost 20 pounds my first trimester. Like, so sick. And just like so much recovery to like be alone and in a house that's safe. Like, to relearn that a bedroom can be a safe place. Like, I used to not sleep for years, and my therapist and I, we'd work on it, and it was like, okay, well, I need to make my bedroom become like a safe place, because it was so terrible before.
Your nervous system just had been so haywire for so long that I'm sure even, just like coming back to yourself and like even feeling safe probably felt disorienting and different. And then you're pregnant. Right. Holy cow, Gabby. Wow.
So anyway, so then I ended up deciding like pretty quick, like I knew I was going to keep it. I just did. And at that point is when I was like, I'm going to press charges, because my family had wanted me to press charges, but I was still protecting. Like, I was like, no. But when it was about this other human, it was like, oh my gosh, yes. Like, I will do whatever it takes to just make sure that she's safe. That was a whole process. Like, I've learned as I've met people that have gone through domestic violence, like, it's so terrible to go through the legal process, and it's draining emotionally and pregnant, like all the things. It just was so rough. And in no way does it, like, it doesn't fulfill, like, I think in some ways I'm sure that he could spin it to be like, oh, she got the revenge that she, and it's like, that does nothing for me. Like, if anything, that was just so that there was a little record, because when I finally came out that I was getting divorced, because that felt like a huge deal. And then it was like, oh, and I'm pregnant.
Yeah, I remember that. I remember seeing your pregnancy announcement and then seeing that you had gotten divorced. And
like,
I don't necessarily remember what I thought of it at the time, but even that's huge, just in like a community for people to be like, what
happened?
Yeah.
Just last night, Collins was asking me to see our gender reveal, and she was like, can I watch the video? And I watched it, and it's just like me alone, and my sister's like, go hug her, and they're like whispering, and I'm just like, my heart breaks at like just that survival that was happening to just show up.
And I'm sure also just steeped in the community you were in, just seeing so many other people doing that in seemingly like
happy.
Mormon happy, and just just thinking, I mean, so many layers I can imagine to that.
So I think that's where I feel a lot of gratitude that I'm out then. Like, I don't know what it would have done for me spiritually to find that out a week before and be like, oh, okay, well, I guess it's meant to be. Because I was then in control of what I told him and when I told him these things and how it was going to work and, you know, all of that. And I had this army behind me. And so to see him like go through the charges and stuff, I knew that would crush him in a lot of ways, just because it was real paper. Like, when I finally posted, his fiance reached out to me and, you know, just was like, I am so sorry, and I know what you went through. And I read it over today, and she just said, I want you to know I believe you 110%. And I thought that was such a good thing to say to somebody that is leaving something like that, because especially when you have these people that are so great in some ways and such great people or whatever it is. I don't even know what my ex is up to now. Like it's, it's its own situation that we'll figure out as time goes on. But I think the church is interesting because it's not like I was married to this low life wife beater wearing guy.
Yeah.
Like this is a guy who wants to be a mission president.
He's teaching Sunday school.
Yeah. And so that's just unique. But I think that's where I just feel I know I'm not alone because people have reached out to me. And then I see a pregnancy announcement and it's like, and it's very common that it's like, he only got physical 3 times. Like, and you're like, okay, well, what's physical? And like, it's so, I feel so lucky that Collins came into my life because it made me draw these lines of like, this is not okay before I even had to walk away from kids or from that with kids.
With kids. How do you feel the community response generally was? Like, where was your faith at that time?
Went to singles ward, pregnant, singles ward pregnant. And that was a lot. Like it was I kind of like to test the waters a little bit. So sometimes I would just
walk in.
Like at first it was like, it would be like, oh, I'm divorced. And then but it became this whole thing that was just exhausting. Like
I bet.
I was just like, this is too much. And so sometimes I'd be like, oh yeah, I'm pregnant. And it was fun to see reactions just because like I got to kind of live it without feeling the shame.
Yeah. I love that
like,
for you.
oh, yeah.
I'm sure people were like, yeah, I'm sure you got all sorts of reactions.
Yes. And so I think that, was its own thing. I was trying so hard to just be in tune, I think, with God because it felt so dark for so long.
Totally.
But religion was hard during it too because like he was going through disfellowship or excommunication, like whatever that was going to look like. And it was frustrating to go through that process and, put your heart on the line and know that like whatever I say, they're just going to do what they think is best. Mm-hmm. But like, again, those consequences don't ever come near to filling this satisfaction. And I think sometimes as I've talked with people about abuse, you feel like you're punishing your abuser and they think that because that's what you're told your whole time that you're going through that. And it's like, no, like that did nothing for my soul, literally not a thing. And it just like, I just wanted paper trails. This is who you were on paper. And I'm not the only girl that's saying this.
Yeah.
And that's really important for future. No matter how he chooses to live his life now, like, whatever he makes of it, fine. But
no, it's really brave because it sounds like not only was it maybe not vindicating, it probably just sucked.
Yes.
Because then you have more work to do.
Yes.
You have more emotional triggers going through it, but you wanted to be sure that you were protecting your child and also it sounds like future women. So at least you could say you did what you could do.
Yeah, exactly. And I think you want to say that to your child too. Like at the end of the day, it's like, I did what I did to protect you because, these were my actions at the time. And I will say like ever since leaving, it's been pretty peaceful. Like I think I have a unique experience where he's not involved right now. And I feel really grateful because I don't know how I could have shown up to be a mom while seeing him. I feel so lucky that we have the situation that we do because it's allowed me to just be there for her. And she's going to have to process a lot as she grows up. It's weird to be talking about it at 5, she just turned 4 and it's like, okay, when she was 0 and I could talk about anything. And the other day she's like, she asked me some question and I was like, oh, I have to figure out like our narrative from this point forward. And she's going to start picking up on things and, so, but as far as spiritually and religiously leaving and everything, I feel like I was in and out for years because I had this baby and it was when I had her that I was like, oh my gosh, the idea of God that I had, like this love that I just went through to have this baby alone. I didn't have anyone in the, my mom was there, but like I didn't really imagine that growing up. Like you think it's your partner and all of this stuff. And so to go through all that sacrifice, I was like, this love that I have for her has to feel so different than this God of shame that I feel like I lived with for so long. And so it was really, I think just in the hospital that I was like, what is life? Like this, I need to figure this out because I don't want to give her these answers to protect the church or protect him anymore. And so that just started a lot more, I think, historical background, looking up stuff and, all the things. But for so long, I remember just about a year ago, I was like, God, I have kept this creek open of the church for so long because I don't want to say, oh, I'm out. Because like you have this thought of like, but what if it is true? And so to close that door seems so scary.
Yeah. And so permanent.
Yes.
Yeah.
And like damaging to the rest of my posterity. And then to date in Provo, Utah, where I'm at is scary. Like
Totally.
It's like, but in a lot of ways I feel grateful because I think it's also really hard to go through a faith transition with a partner too. I have pros too, I think, being able to do it alone. But I just finally was like, I'm going to shut this door for a minute. And that I feel like is when I experience peace to just be me. And it doesn't mean I have to like give all these reasons, like I experiment with what I want to experiment with. And I kind of am just way more at peace following myself. And I think one of the biggest struggles that I've had with church status is a lot of it looks so cultural. When I got my first tattoo, I know it was like, oh, she's struggling. And it's almost like because I had this struggling story, I think it does give a lot of peace to them that maybe I'll come back and maybe, and I'm not letting him take away anything else anymore. Like he took away so much of my life, so much time, so many moments that I wish I had with a partner, but he didn't take away my faith. Like I still have my belief in God, but it's not him that caused me to leave church. Like I'm not offended at authority because of that. And I think that's an important piece because it's easy when we are members of the church to look at that and give our own excuses.
Yeah. That's a really powerful distinction. I was talking to a friend who came out as gay about their faith journey. She said that it was really important for her to distinguish. She came out as gay and she left the church. She didn't come out as gay, and that those are two different things.
Yeah.
And I realized like, oh, I think that's kind of a little bit of a bias I had of just thinking like, oh yeah, certain things happen. And I guess people could say that like, well, yeah, of course she left the church because this is what happened. But I think that's really important to say this happened to me. And obviously like you learned a lot of things through that.
Sure.
But it's really cool to hear you talk about it because yes, it sounds like a lot of those things were clearly intertwined with church culture and church doctrine, but it sounds like what you ultimately, from hearing your story, learned was like your power and yourself. And then that seems to have informed where you feel you are spiritually now, as opposed to like, I don't know, that just feels like a really powerful distinction. And so I appreciate you saying that. And I can imagine, in distancing yourself from the church, it might be frustrating that people are like, well, yeah, because she went through, and you're like, no, like I made this decision.
Yes, it didn't happen to me.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it is frustrating. Like I feel like I've gone through times where I like try to share that, and it's like, you can think what you want.
I know, and they will anyway.
Like,
Yeah.
yes. And that's okay. Like it is what it is.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. It's really powerful to hear your story. It really is. And it will be deeply inspiring to people who are in similar situations and also to people who are not in similar situations, because I think there's a lot that I resonate with. It is, I think, a really beautiful testament to resilience. And, there's a lot of ways I think that your story could have gone. And I just see so much resilience, and I'm sure it was not easy, but kind of continual coming back to yourself. And I just really admire it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I will say too with that, I think that a lot of people relate because like in a lot of ways, it was easier too to say that he physically hurt me, because not easier. It was more valid for divorce. It was more valid because he crossed these boundaries. The parts that break me today are the beliefs that I have that he gave me of myself. Like the bruises are gone. Like I have pictures and it makes me sad. The beliefs that he told me who I was and who I'd never become. And like those things are what I remember in the mirror. And so I think that I just wanted to say that too, because I think it's easy to look at something and be like, oh, I've never gone through that.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, yeah, but have you been in other situations that aren't okay? And I think as I've navigated other unhealthy relationships in my life, it's been like figuring out myself and trusting myself at the end of the day instead of trusting what I think. Like as a parent, it's so stressful to decide how you're going to parent. And sometimes it's intentional and sometimes it's not. I think at the end of the day, we're that much more powerful when we're just ourselves. And I think in a lot of ways, I couldn't be that in the church.
I was thinking when you were talking about that moment you realized you were pregnant and all of the sudden things kind of crystallized. And I was thinking about how beautiful that is, but also how, and I relate entirely, but how I wish we could have that for ourselves.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Exactly.
And I think that's one of the things about being a mom that's kind of crazy is because I'm going through this in a big way where I'm like, I'm looking at my children and I'm like, how do I treat myself a certain way when I would never in a trillion years treat my children a certain way or say certain things, the classic,
Yes.
like you shouldn't say to yourself what you wouldn't say to your child or your friend or whatever, but you feel it in a different way.
Yeah.
But it's opened this kind of portal for me of like, I deserve that too.
Yes.
But I don't think we were taught that. And maybe
No.
some people were, or maybe some people feel that. And maybe you do. I keep saying we. I don't
No,
think
yeah.
I was taught that.
No.
And I think that's a really powerful thing of like, oh, we should be cultivating that. And for me, that's one of the biggest downfalls of the Mormon religion is like, to me, that's kind of the most important thing now is like cultivating self-love and self-respect and self-compassion. And I just don't feel like Mormonism did that for me. Yeah. And maybe it does for other people, but for me, it gives me a lot of peace to be on that journey now. And I don't think I could be on that same journey as well without stepping away.
Yeah. And I think I love that. I think I'm so grateful that we are learning that as young parents too. I think it's just helping me be a better parent to not have this filter that I need to parent or be a certain way. And it's like, I get to decide what's best.
Yeah.
And that's very scary, but I feel good about it. So,
and you learn how to do it. It's like you practice it.
Yeah.
And I think there's so many things in wake of a faith transition too that you just, it's hard, but you practice it and then it gets a little easier. You get a little better about respecting your own intuition and your own decisions. And it's an exciting thing. But I do feel like so many of us, I was talking to my therapist the other day and she's like, you're still getting your sea legs. Like you're not used to this. And I was like, oh, that's really validating and also really exciting. Because I'm like, I think we're all on our journey towards getting more there. And thank you so much, Gabby.
Thank you.
Seriously. I so appreciate you sharing. Like I've said a million times, I'll say it a million times more. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you everyone for listening. Bye.
GIRLSC it's Girls Camp.
This has been a 58 Ember production. For more shows, please visit the 58 Ember channel, 58ember.com, or find us at 58 Ember Media on socials.